Rome, Italy, August 14th, 2003. It was a warm summer morning, and Leonardo da Vinci Fiumicino Airport buzzed with travelers preparing for the holiday exodus. Among the many flights scheduled, one in particular was flight CTA-112, bound for Palermo, Sicily, a short domestic route just over an hour in the air. Nothing out of the ordinary. At gate B7, the passengers of CTA-112 were boarding with a mix of anticipation and routine weariness. Families headed for reunions, couples on honeymoon, elderly travelers returning to their hometowns. Flight CTA-112 was set to depart at 9:10 a.m., operated by Italiafly, a now-defunct regional airline. On board were 92 passengers and 4 crew members. What no one knew then, not the air traffic controllers, not the airline's dispatch center, not even the captain, was that this flight would not arrive in Palermo. Not that day, not that year. At 9:06 a.m., the aircraft taxied into position. The captain, Stefano Mariani, gave his final briefing to the cabin crew. The flight received takeoff clearance. It was recorded on radar, ascending into clear skies. At 9:13 a.m., it made its final routine communication with Rome Center. Climbing through FL-190, all systems normal, and then nothing. Flight CTA-112 vanished from radar. No emergency call, no transponder signal, no debris, no weather anomalies. Just gone. The initial response was confusion, then protocol kicked in. The Italian Air Force launched immediate search and rescue operations. Civil protection teams combed the countryside. The sea near Naples and the Tyrrhenian coast was patrolled for days, but not a single trace was found. Families were told it could be a crash. The airline insisted they were cooperating with authorities. Conspiracy theories exploded: hijacking, military testing gone wrong, a secret base, even supernatural disappearance. But no theory ever brought closure. Weeks turned into months, then years. CTA-112 joined the long list of unexplained aviation mysteries. Families held annual memorials. Some fought to keep the investigation open. Others gave in to silence and grief. Then came August 14th, 2023. Exactly 20 years to the day since the flight vanished. Leonardo da Vinci Airport received a mayday signal. Weak, static-laced, but unmistakably from an aircraft identifying itself as CTA-112. Controllers froze. That flight code hadn't been used in decades. At 9:07 a.m., the same time it had originally taken off, a radar contact appeared. A blip, flying at 29,000 feet, approaching from the west. The transponder code matched. The flight path was identical to 2003's. It was impossible. Yet air traffic control followed protocol. Military jets were scrambled. The blip continued, descending smoothly. No visual contact until the final descent, when an aging McDonnell Douglas MD-82 emerged from the clouds, flaps extended, landing gear down. It touched down at 9:34 a.m., taxiing calmly to the same gate it had departed from 20 years earlier. No emergency declared, no signs of damage. When authorities opened the door, expecting a ghost plane or at worst a mass tragedy, they found 96 confused, healthy individuals. Passengers believed it was still 2003. Time, for them, had not passed. They were met by a wall of silence, the kind that hums with fluorescent lights and shoe soles on polished floors, and the clipped language of professionals trying to sound calmer than they feel. The aircraft door opened onto a jet bridge that smelled faintly of disinfectant and new paint, not the sun-bleached rubber they remembered from 2003. The first to step out was a boy with a dinosaur backpack who had fallen asleep before takeoff and now asked his mother if they were already in Palermo. The mother smiled automatically and then saw the uniforms, medical, police, airport operations, and her smile folded in on itself. The boy kept walking, tugging at her hand. He stopped when he noticed the cameras pointed down, but recording anyway. Somewhere behind the glass, 100 phones were angled like a constellation. They were routed not to the main terminal, but to a cordoned-off arrivals wing, where rolling stretchers and collapsible screens had been set up in an hour by people who'd only trained for this in tabletop exercises. The officers wore the insignia of Polizia di Frontiera, a carabiniere with gentle eyes, repeated in slow Italian and in English that everything was okay, that they'd do routine medical checks, that families were being contacted. It was the truth, and also not enough to contain what was happening. Passengers answered questions as if the same clock beat in all their heads. Name, seat number, where they were headed in Palermo, who was picking them up. They offered phone numbers written in careful pen-on-paper agendas, numbers that had long since been reassigned, deactivated, memorialized. One elderly man recited his daughter's mobile from memory. Later, when an investigator dialed it, a stranger in Milan answered and hung up without a word. Another woman asked if she could pay for a coffee with a €5 note. She stared at it like a talisman, unaware that euros had not changed, but everything else had. The crew were steadying themselves the way professionals do when there's no procedure, by inventing one. Captain Stefano Mariani kept rubbing at the indentation the headset left on his hair, asking if there had been a radar glitch. First Officer Chiara Bellini checked her logbook, astonished that her last entry, 9:13 a.m., all systems normal, was still ink wet. The cabin chief, a Sicilian named Rosalia, tried to line the passengers into family groups the way she would for an irregular operation, anything to give shape to the hours. When a young doctor in navy scrubs explained gently that they would be taken to a nearby facility for observation, Rosalia asked how long. "A day," the doctor said, because that fit into the world as she knew it. It would not be a day. News ran faster than protocol. In the suburbs of Rome and across Sicily, and in cities that had kept grief in drawers, old group chats lit up. Except they weren't chats, but email lists that had metamorphosed into Facebook groups, then into dormant pages with pinned posts from 2011 and 2016, when a search phase was closed. The CTA 112 Families Committee, founded by a woman named Teresa Rinaldi months after the disappearance, had never formally dissolved. Its posts were clean now, empty of new comments, a mausoleum of pixels. At 10:02 a.m. on August 14, 2023, a new message appeared. Urgent. Reports say CTA 112 has landed at FCO. If anyone can confirm, please call me. The number was the same as the one printed on church leaflets 2 decades earlier. People who hadn't spoken in years dialed anyway. Teresa was 69 now, a retired schoolteacher with a cardigan folded over the back of a chair she never sat in, because hope is posture. Her son, Marco, had been 24 when he boarded CTA 112 with a suitcase full of books bound for a teaching job in Palermo. She had trained herself not to picture his last minutes, not to pick fights with the invisible. The training fell apart in seconds when the neighbor pounded on her door holding up a phone. "Signora, look!" She saw the headline and didn't read the text. She went to the wardrobe, pulled out a shoebox where she'd kept his spare house keys, a photo of him with sunburnt cheeks, the airline's last letter. "If he is there," she said to the empty room, "he will be thirsty," and filled a bottle of water before calling a taxi. At the facility near Fiumicino, a conference room had been turned into a temporary reception hall. The whiteboard still had the week's meeting schedule in marker. A nurse taped over it a sign that said, "Families," in block letters. In trickles at first, and then, in a small flood, they arrived, men with white at their temples who had been boys when they waited at gate B7 with flowers. Women whose hands trembled because memory returns to the body before it returns to the tongue. A teenager who wasn't born when the flight vanished, clutching a printout of his father's face, asking what he should feel if the father didn't remember him. Security checked names. Counselors set out tissues like sacrament. The first reunion did not feel like a reunion. A middle-aged man named Paolo was led into a room where his wife, Elena, sat on a plastic chair with a blanket around her shoulders, and eyes wide the way eyes get when the world changes its rules. Paolo had remarried more than a decade ago after a priest told him that love and truth could coexist. He held his breath in a way that hurt in the ribs. Elena looked at him, took a second as if changing focus, then, with the reflex of a shared life, said, "You forgot your sunglasses again?" And he laughed, and then covered his face and sobbed in a voice he didn't recognize. His second wife sat in the hall outside with a counselor who kept saying the right things. Compassion has a syntax, but none of the right things could edit this sentence of a life. Not all convergences found their counterpart. Teresa waited in the family's room with her water bottle and the shoebox in a tote bag, and every time the door opened, she stood as if a bell had rung for her. A man in a registrar's lanyard approached with a ledger. "Signora Rinaldi," he said softly, "we believe your son is on the manifest. We need to verify things carefully." She nodded and signed her name. Later, when they brought in the passengers one by one to compare records and faces, a woman who remembered where Marco had stowed his carry-on, the overhead 3 rows from the back, lifted a hand. "He read to my daughter during taxi," she said. "He had a way of making time pass." Teresa smiled at the verb choice, then felt the floor roll under her as if she were at sea. Time, again. The authorities moved along 2 tracks that barely touched: compassion and forensics. ENAC officials asked the questions that make sense in accident reports and never will in kitchens. ENAV pulled radar tapes that, impossibly, matched the shape of a moment from 20 years ago. The Air Force crews who had escorted the MD-82 down filed reports that were precise until the page where they had to explain what they saw, and the adjectives began to fail them. The airplane itself, its paint faded to a shade the brand hadn't used since 2005, carried maintenance stickers with dates that technicians examined with magnifying glasses. Fuel samples were identical in composition to batches archived in old quality control logs. The onboard clock had drifted by mere seconds. The coffee in the galley had the burned sweetness of an hour on a hot plate. Doctors ran tests out of an abundance that felt like caution and faith. Blood pressures, oxygen saturation, toxins. No one was dehydrated. No one showed signs of exposure to anything but the ordinary anxieties of a trip. The passengers' circadian rhythms corresponded to a morning flight that had lasted an hour. When asked to recall announcements, multiple people repeated verbatim the captain's cheery note about clear weather over the Tyrrhenian Sea. When told the calendar date, some squinted as if the joke had been poorly timed. "No," one man said. "It's August." "It is August," the nurse answered. He shook his head. 2003. A small boy wandered to the window and pressed his fingers to the glass. Beyond, a modern terminal he didn't recognize reflected a world with different fonts. He told his mother he could count the planes. She said not now, and then, ashamed of the harshness, kissed his head and inhaled the shampoo she had bought on sale in 2003, the smell that told her who she was. Later, when they offered the child a tablet loaded with cartoons so his mother could speak with a counselor, he tapped the glass and asked where the buttons were. 2 decades of interface had to be relearned by a woman who didn't know yet that her father had died in 2011, that a niece had grown up and had a child of her own, that the grocery on their corner had become a bar with Edison bulbs and reclaimed wood. Television producers begged for access and were told no in 5 different ways. That meant maybe later. A rumor that the passengers were actors paid by the state flared and burned out in an afternoon. Another rumor that the flight had skimmed the edge of a NATO exercise and slipped into some pocket of bent time, lodged like a splinter. In the evenings, the facility quieted. In those hours, the families spoke with the voice people use when waking sleepers, gentle and precise, leaving room for either outcome. They showed photographs that looked like yesterday to the people in the pictures. They used metaphors of storms and tunnels and paused clocks. Some conversations lasted 10 minutes, some lasted all night. One father, who had taken early retirement to raise grandchildren that didn't exist yet, sat and told his daughter how Palermo had changed. The new bakery, the bench by the fountain that had disappeared, how he had stopped walking past the airport because it demanded answers he didn't have. Near midnight, a counselor walked Teresa down a quiet corridor to a door with a paper number taped to it. She asked if she wanted a moment before they went in. Teresa shook her head. She had had 20 years of moments. Inside, a young man sat on a bed in a blue Italiafly blanket, knees pulled up, hair a little too long as if he'd missed a barber by a week or a life. He looked up and saw her the way one recognizes a skyline. "Mama," he said, the word falling into a groove it had kept for him. She opened her mouth and a laugh came out before the sob, because joy is faster. She went to him and put her palm on his cheek the way she had done when he was feverish at 7. He studied her face, her new years, and then, as if filling a glass to the brim, smiled. They held each other rocking a small boat moored back at last. Down the hall, Captain Mariani sat with investigators drawing the flight path he had flown 1,000 times. His hands suggested holds and headings in the air. It was routine, he kept saying, and in those words was a prayer. He asked after colleagues, naming pilots who had aged, retired, died. When told he would not yet be allowed to call home because the process needed scaffolding, he nodded like a professional and then stared at his hands for a long time, as if the answer might be written on them in a script only he could read. Outside, Fiumicino's late flights spooled and landed and taxied as if the world were still bound to schedules. The MD-82 slept on a pad under floodlights, its windows reflecting a skyless black. Technicians circled it, but rarely touched. Someone had placed cones around the tires, as if to keep it from rolling back into whatever had held it. In a staff room, a controller replayed the recording where the call sign first appeared, the static-laced Mayday. He turned the volume up until the hiss sounded like the ocean. He wondered whether the ocean kept time differently. Morning would bring press conferences and scientists from universities with instruments that could learn something or nothing. Morning would bring lawyers and claims and forms, new kinds of grief for the families whose lives had grown around absence like vines around a frame. But in the first night of the return, in the rooms where the body remembers before the mind believes, there were small, precise mercies, coffee that tasted the same, a squeak in a mother's laugh that matched the one a son carried in memory, a knit scarf that had been fashionable in 2003 and somehow looked beautiful again, like a color the world had briefly forgotten. In those mercies, the families built a bridge to cross from myth to daybreak. They were not ready. They crossed anyway. By morning, the airport had the dazed order of a festival after the lights are cut. Trash cans overflowing with bouquets, security lines taped into new shapes, loudspeakers repeating the same 3 announcements because no one knew what else to say. Inside the medical facility, the passengers of CTA-112 woke at different speeds to the same revelation. A nurse placed a newspaper on a tray, and a man flinched at the date. Another asked if the photograph had been printed wrong. Breakfast was a lesson in labels, gluten-free options that didn't exist in their vocabulary, milk in screw-top cartons, coffee so strong it felt like a dare. A social worker handed out a packet titled Orientation for Returning Travelers and flushed when she heard the title aloud. Someone crossed out travelers and wrote families. The law had kept meticulous score during the years that life did not. Death certificates had been issued in 2008 after the courts concluded the search. Pensions recalculated, inheritances probated, apartments sold to strangers who dragged new sofas up old stairs. Now lawyers in careful suits explained that resurrection was a legal term as well as a metaphor. We can petition to vacate a death decree, one said to a circle of relatives who admired the symmetry of his tie because they could not forgive him the ease. We can restore identity documents, reopen estates, unwind contracts where possible. Unwind was the word they kept using, as if 20 years could be unspooled neatly back onto a factory spool. Paolo listened with his hands in his pockets, Elena's blanket around her shoulders, and his second wife at the end of the row, and he realized there was no grammar that made everyone true at once. Technology arrived like a second language that pretended to be a dialect. Counselors set up a table of phones and tablets and told the passengers they could reach anyone with a face and a number. Several reached for rotary gestures that made the volunteers smile and then stop smiling. Marco sat with Teresa and a technician who showed him how to tap glass. "The buttons are under the picture," he said, and the technician, who had taught children and retirees alike, felt unexpectedly humbled. Teresa opened a messaging app and stared at the list of names. Neighbors, cousins, church friends, all still organized because grief had made her tidy. When Marco wrote, "I'm here," the dots pulsed and then multiplied into a chorus of replies that felt like a room filling with air. Science did what science does. It collected swabs, samples, scans. Investigators removed the flight data recorder as if they were lifting an heirloom. When they played it back, the tape ended 58 minutes after takeoff, with the captain humming a tune from the radio and a steward asking for hot water. No anomaly, no scream of static. The cockpit voice recorder stopped at the same place, a soft click as ordinary as a comma. The aircraft's maintenance logs, unchanged since 2003, were photographed like frescoes. Outside, volunteers built a fence of temporary privacy around the fuselage with white panels that wobbled in the breeze. Inside, Rosalia parceled out cabin memories like rations. Seat 12C had asked for tomato juice. Seat 23A had been nervous and then calm. A couple in row 3 had whispered and held hands. Facts were kindness when answers refused to be. Not all returns returned to the same address. A woman in her 40s waited on a bench for a father who had sold the family's hardware store in 2010 and moved inland. He arrived in a borrowed car, older than the stories she'd told her children, and hugged her while apologizing for the years he hadn't lived. A young man met the son conceived days before the flight, their faces mirrored at the cheekbones but tilted at the mouth. They walked the hallway, absorbing each other's pace. "I kept your name," the son said, gentle. "I kept your laugh," the father answered, and the corridor turned into a chapel. Anger had its place, too. In one room, a brother lifted his voice at a liaison, demanding back pay from a company that no longer existed. In another, a woman asked how she was supposed to explain to a fiancé that her husband had come home precisely as promised, only 20 years late. The liaison wrote notes in a notebook already full: special commission, emergency fund, psychological care for all parties, no cameras until consent. He wrote consent twice. Outside, a small crowd held candles at the fence line, the wicks stuttering in the sea wind. Someone sang a hymn that had been sung at the memorials, and the melody wove through metal and glass. The boy with the dinosaur backpack asked if Triceratops was still the strongest. A paleontology student volunteering as a translator said scientists had changed their minds about many things, and the boy nodded as if that were the most reasonable news of the day. He and his mother toured a vending machine as if it were a museum exhibit. He picked a chocolate bar he remembered, and it tasted almost the same. "Time is a road with exits," his mother told him that night, inventing a story that could carry them both. "We took the wrong one and somehow came back where we were going." Toward evening, an official from ENAV gathered families and crew for an announcement. The airline could not answer for the past, he said, but Italy could answer for the present. There would be housing near the airport as long as needed, stipends, a team dedicated to legal remedies. And when appropriate, there would be a flight to Palermo. Not a spectacle, not an experiment, but a promise kept. The room murmured, the sound of a knot loosening by a fraction. Teresa squeezed Marco's hand until he made a small sound, and she apologized and did not let go. Before lights out, a counselor asked each family to write one postcard to themselves, dated 2003, to be opened in a week. It helps the mind build a bridge, she said. People wrote advice and jokes and recipes and the names of streets that no longer existed. Teresa wrote, "Buy that wine you loved, it will still be good." Marco wrote, "Don't rush, she is coming." Paolo wrote nothing and folded the card anyway because absence was part of his alphabet. When the hallway fell quiet, doors clicked like punctuation. In the courtyard, a late flight clawed at the sky and curved away toward Sicily. In a dozen rooms, people lay awake and practiced the words they would need for the next day. Some were simple, yes, here, now. Some were sentences that would take years to finish. On the second day, the air seemed thinner, as if the building itself were breathing with everyone inside and counting along. Counselors replaced the word orientation with reunion on the day's schedule, and no one corrected them. A logistics team handed out analog watches because many of the passengers trusted hands over digits. The little ticking circles felt like companions. A university group arrived with scanners and quiet voices to map the cabin as a museum would. But before any instrument beeped, they asked permission from Rosalia, who had begun to stand guard at the airplane door like a parish caretaker. She let Teresa and Marco board for a few minutes first. The galley smelled faintly of coffee grounds that had outlived reason. An emergency manual sat in its holder like a hymn book. Teresa touched the top of seat 19C with the flat of her palm, the way you test a surface for heat. Marco laughed softly. "I was worried I'd be taller than the aisle." He had grown, impossibly. The aisle had not. On their way out, they met Rosalia, who remembered his questions about reading. "You made the takeoff go faster," she told him, and he smiled as if clockwork could be kind. Downstairs, a lawyer with dark crescents under his eyes convened the first triage conference, a phrase that made the room wince. Paolo sat with Elena and with Anna, the second wife, in a triangle that had no geometry in any book. The lawyer spoke of petitions and affidavits. Anna spoke of kindness. "I will not be erased," she said without raising her voice, "but neither will she." Elena wrapped the blanket tighter and nodded, because the ground must be made level before you can walk together. They agreed on small things that could be honored immediately. No cameras near their corridor, a schedule so no one would be surprised by the other's presence, a shared message for friends that did not invite sides. Later, Paolo carried a paper cup of tea to Elena and an espresso to Anna and thought, "There will be 1,000 such carries, and if I do them one by one, the years might learn to stack without falling." In a side room, First Officer Chiara met schoolchildren brought by a teacher who believed witnessing gentleness was part of civic education. She showed them the old safety card as if it were a storybook, tracing the pictograms with a pen. "Here is how you help the person next to you. Here is how the light leads you when the cabin goes dark." The boy with the dinosaur backpack sat cross-legged on the floor and drew 2 parallel runways that merged into one with a crayon the color of salt. "Which one is home?" the teacher asked, and he said, "Both if you land slow." Chiara blinked away a sudden sting and asked if she could keep the drawing. The boy considered and then gave her half, tearing carefully down the middle so each of them would have a runway to carry. The question of Palermo, whether, when, how, hovered over every conversation like weather. An ENAV official proposed a continuation flight, not symbolic but practical, faithful to a promise interrupted. The MD-82 would remain grounded for investigation and, perhaps, preservation. ITA Airways had offered an aircraft and crew. The passengers would be free to choose. No one would be staged. The room murmured with a sound that was not quite relief and not quite fear. Teresa lifted her hand. "We go together," she said, and then, more quietly, "But we arrive as who we are now." Heads around her nodded. A priest and an imam, who had both ministered at the 2004 memorial, shook hands in a corner like craftsmen inspecting a joint. Outside, a journalist pressed her card to the glass of the security door for Teresa, as if paper could pass through air by intention. Teresa touched 2 fingers to her lips and then to the card, a blessing and a boundary at once. Small economies of wonder developed. A pastry chef from Fiumicino sent trays of maritozzi with cream piled high, saying he had kept aside the recipe he used in 2003 for a day that would deserve it. A barber set up 2 chairs in a conference nook and gave haircuts to anyone who asked, refusing payment and weeping only once when a mother requested the school picture trim he had before the trip. A shipping company offered to locate lost luggage that had never been lost, only orphaned in time. Somewhere, a blue Samsonite crowed its good luck. In the evenings, a violinist from the airport police band played under a stairwell where the acoustics were forgiving. Passengers leaned on the railings and let the bow stitch them to the hour. As the week bent toward decision, Captain Mariani asked to speak to the families. He stood without uniform on a low step, so no one had to look up far. "I took you up," he said, and the room made a sound like breath returning. "I meant to bring you down an hour later. I have rehearsed an apology in my head for 20 years. It keeps breaking on the same rock. I don't know what happened. I can only say, I will fly you to Palermo if you want me to, or I will stand at the gate and watch you go with someone else, and both will be acts of love. Silence is a mirror that shows the shape of truth." In it, Chiara reached for his shoulder. Rosalia closed her eyes. Teresa nodded once. Paolo clapped first, twice, and then everyone did, not to absolve him but to place him back among them. That night, volunteers handed out boarding cards reprinted from an archive photograph. Cream paper, serif type, the ghost of a logo. People wrote their names with pens that bled a little. Some tucked the cards into pockets like amulets. Some slid them under pillows. The schedule said wheels up at dusk the following day because Palermo's light at that hour forgives faces. When the building quieted, Teresa walked the corridor one last time and stopped at a window where the runway centerline glowed like a thread laid on black cloth. She pressed her palm to the glass and imagined it warm from the friction of all the years. "Slow," she told herself aloud, and the word did not mean delay. It meant care. In the dark, a maintenance truck rolled past the sleeping MD-82 and paused as if to listen, then moved on, leaving a small wake of air that touched nothing and yet rippled everything the way time does when it decides briefly to be kind. Dusk carried a softness that the schedule could not have planned. The airport assigned a quiet gate at the end of a concourse where the windows looked west, and the light laid itself down in long, forgiving bands. The ITA Airways A320 waited with its nose angled slightly toward the runway, as if eager to close a parenthesis. Checkpoints had been simplified to a handshake of identity and care. No cameras, no press, only workers who found reasons to linger with mops and trolleys and stand a respectful distance away. The boarding cards, reprinted in cream paper, were scanned with modern beeps that felt almost rude. Rosalia greeted each passenger with the same line, "Benvenuti di nuovo, welcome back," and added a private note for those she remembered. Tomato juice for 12C, extra blanket for row 23, patience for the anxious couple in 3A and 3C, who now walked separately but chose to sit together anyway. Captain Mariani and First Officer Chiara wore ITA uniforms borrowed for the occasion, their original wings pinned above the new insignia. An additional captain rode the jump seat by regulation, a calm presence who would take control if needed. He had insisted that the original crew lead the human part of the flight, even if the legal part was complicated. Before boarding, he shook Teresa's hand and said something she would repeat later to anyone who asked why they went. A promise wants gravity. Teresa answered that gravity too could be kind. They boarded at their own pace. The boy with the dinosaur backpack compared the teeth of the jet bridge to the ones he remembered and decided this one looked friendlier. His mother paused at the threshold of the cabin, surprised at the scent, new plastic and citrus cleaner instead of old coffee, and then found calm in the sameness of seatbelts clicking and overhead bins latching. Marco guided Teresa down the aisle to 19C, though the numbers meant less now than the rhythm of their steps. She carried the shoebox in her tote and the water bottle with the label rubbed smooth by her hands. She slid both under the seat and whispered, "We'll open them in Palermo," as if there were corks in time. The safety demonstration made the cabin hold its breath. Chiara's voice was steady, the same cadence she had used 1,000 times, but when she said, "Put on your mask first before helping others," it landed differently, like a lesson learned backward. A few people closed their eyes. Paolo glanced across the aisle at Elena and then back at Anna, one row behind. Both women gave the smallest nods, a semaphore of adulthood. The violinist from the stairwell took a seat near the rear and placed the instrument case in the overhead like a living passenger. A flight attendant offered him water. He said he would play in Palermo, not a note sooner. Pushback came with a gentle shudder. The crew taxied past the pad where the MD-82 sat under floodlights, a witness in older paint. People turned their heads as if passing a familiar house at night. Mariani announced a short taxi and a standard departure to the south, his voice carrying the smile that lives at the edge of formality. When they lined up, the sun was a thin coin on the horizon. The engines rose, the runway stripes strobed, and the A320 began that magic trick of turning weight into lift. Hands reached across aisles, breath lifted as one system. Climb-out revealed the Tyrrhenian Sea as a plate of hammered metal. Teresa pressed her forehead to the window and let the cold mark her skin. Marco pointed to a freighter's wake and named the geometry of it, a teacher even now. She told him the word for that pattern she'd learned from his books, and he laughed, delighted that she remembered anything beyond recipes. The cabin crew rolled a cart with water and biscotti. People took the biscuits like communion. A woman asked if she could call her sister from the sky, and a purser, older than the phone and kinder than the policy, said yes, for this hour the rules were made of breath. Somewhere over Naples, the PA chimed, and Rosalia's voice filled the cabin, lower and richer than the interphone ever made it sound. She thanked them for trusting the sky again, thanked the ground teams, thanked time for bending without breaking. Then she said the part that no manual covers. If you feel tears, let them do their work. If you feel laughter, let that too. A smattering of chuckles rolled forward, tripped by a sigh, caught by a cheer that didn't quite dare to be loud. The jump-seat captain glanced sideways at Mariani and saw the set of his jaw relax by a degree. He looked back to the instruments and let the moment anchor him. Descent began with a tilt that brought the mountains into view. The western light poured like honey over Monte Pellegrino and the bowl of the Conca d'Oro. Chiara pointed out landmarks as if telling a bedtime story. The harbor, the ribbon of road, the stadium, like a thumbprint. Paolo reached forward and rested 2 fingers on the top of Elena's seat, then sat back and did the same to Anna's. It was clumsy and exact, and both women smiled, because clumsy is how you touch the present when it has waited too long. Teresa took the water bottle from the tote and twisted the cap an inch, as if to equalize pressure between years. Flaps went to the numbers, the gear thumped, the ground grew details. People inhaled together when the runway rushed to meet them and exhaled at the soft double bump that meant the wheels had opinions. The reversers growled and stilled. Silence arrived like a tide slipping under a door. Someone clapped twice, then stopped unsure. Rosalia started again, steady, and the sound caught fire until the whole cabin was a pair of hands. Mariani's face tipped to shadow. Chiara let her head rest back against the seat and closed her eyes for 3 beats, not from fatigue, but from arrival. The jet bridge met them with a longer embrace than usual. The airport had arranged a private corridor lined with potted olive trees and white drapes that moved with the air conditioning like seagrass. Workers from cleaning crews stood along the wall, hats in hand. There were no banners. A small sign read simply, "Benvenuti." People stepped onto Sicilian floorboards with the careful delight of first snow. The boy with the backpack tapped a tree and whispered, "We made it." His mother kissed the top of his head the way she had done in Rome 2 decades earlier. Then and now, a loop closed. In the receiving room, municipal clerks waited with temporary documents, doctors with brief checklists, councillors with chairs angled not to trap. Someone had brewed coffee that tasted exactly like every morning in a kitchen where a radio speaks softly. Teresa set the shoebox on a table, removed the keys, and pressed them into Marco's palm. "Your turn to carry them," she said. He understood without translation. Outside, Palermo exhaled the scent of salt and exhaust and baking bread. A younger moon climbed the indigo and pretended it had been there all along. Palermo received them like a relative who had saved a chair at the table and only now realized how long it had been. The receiving room emptied into a courtyard, tiled in terracotta, where air moved slowly and smelled of lemon leaves and bus brakes. Clerks stamped documents with care, as if pressure could make ink more truthful. A volunteer handed out small paper maps of the center with circles in ballpoint, motels cooperating, a pharmacy that stayed open late, a cafe that would extend tabs without fuss. People folded the maps and kept them anyway, talismans against getting lost in a city they could traverse blindfolded in memory. Teresa and Marco declined the shuttle and took a taxi that drove the way Sicilian taxis do, resigned and alert. He narrated streets in half-remembered order, pointing out a bakery that used to be another bakery, a cinema that had become apartments, a carousel of public works that had turned scaffolding into tradition. At their old building, the paint was a newer yellow that pretended to be the old yellow. The buzzer panel had more names, fewer bells. Teresa pulled the leather strap of her tote through her fingers 3 times and pressed the button for their apartment because ritual is a way of breathing. A woman answered with a nurse's voice. Teresa said her name and the flight number, and the woman came down without asking for ID. The story had reached even kitchens. Her name was Julia. She led them up the worn steps and opened the door to a room that was both theirs and not. The balcony, the same size as the evening, the tile cooler, the shadows in different places. "The landlord told me," she said, apologetic and proud, "that once the keys belonged to a teacher." Teresa smiled at the present tense. She placed the shoebox on the counter and did not open it. Marco walked to the balcony and looked for the scratch he had made on the railing with a coin. The railing had been replaced. To console them, Julia fetched a basil plant and said, "I think the smell helps." Teresa crushed a leaf between fingers and pressed the green to her wrist like a dab of perfume. "It does," she said, surprised by how fast the memory ran. They stayed only 10 minutes. Before leaving, Julia took a small square of patterned ceramic from a drawer. "They changed the kitchen last year," she said. "The workman saved 1 tile for me because I like the pattern. It feels like it should be yours." Teresa accepted it with both hands, the way one receives a wafer. In the stairwell, she passed the keys to Marco, as promised at the airport. He slipped them into his pocket, and they made the old sound against his phone, 2 times talking. Elsewhere, Palermo braided old and new around the returning. Paolo walked with Elena under ficus trees, whose roots had turned sidewalks into geology. They stopped outside his parents' building, where the window boxes had surrendered to cactus. Anna waited at a cafe across the square, a measured distance that made everything possible. Paolo's mother opened the door with the outrageous calm of a person who had already practiced both outcomes. She took Elena's face in both hands and kissed her forehead, then motioned to the kitchen in that Sicilian shorthand that means sit, eat, tell me everything. At dinner, they put 3 plates on the table, 1 for the past, 1 for the present, 1 for whoever they became. When a neighbor knocked with a pie and curiosity, Paolo's father met him at the landing and said, "Not tonight." And the neighbor understood, because Palermo understands nights that are not for telling. The crew kept their own appointments with the city. Chiara went to the seafront and watched ferries churn a grammar into the water. Rosalia found the parish where she used to light candles after long shifts and stayed so long in the cool that her phone, on silent, missed every call. Captain Mariani wrote letters he would not send to colleagues retired, to one who had died, to a version of himself who thought every approach was a rehearsal for the next. He folded the pages and left them under a stone on the harbor wall, an offering to an honest wind. A small museum opened late for a boy with a dinosaur backpack and a mother who needed something to be easy. The volunteer who had been a paleontology student met them at the door and showed them a fossil they could touch with one finger. "Strength is complicated," he said, and the boy nodded with grave authority. On the way out, they passed a television in a bar replaying footage of an A320 rolling to a stop. The bartender turned the volume down without being asked. Questions waited in clean rooms with microphones. The National Commission met in the prefecture with windows that looked onto trees that remembered everything. Engineers walked through data like archaeologists, patient with layers. The recorders had no fear to give. The fuel said nothing helpful. A fisherman north of Naples had reported a strange humming the week before, but his story had the soft edges of dream and kindness. When a journalist asked the mayor if the city would erect a monument, the mayor said, "The people were the monument," and for once that line did not sound borrowed. At night, the returning learned the choreography of sleep in a place that felt like a translation, where the kettle is, which switch controls which light, the different music of these pipes. Teresa could not sleep. She went to the balcony of their new room, hotel curtains cut to brush the sill like careful bangs, and watched scooters pluck notes from the street. Marco joined her and leaned his shoulder against hers in a way that had not been possible when he was 24 and taller in hope than in height. "Tomorrow I'll go to the school," he said. "The street is the same, even if the students aren't." Teresa nodded. "Tomorrow I will buy that wine," she said, and then, almost laughing, "if the shop exists and if my hand remembers how to carry 2 bottles." Down the hall, Elena wrote 2 letters on hotel stationery, one to a man sleeping in her mother-in-law's spare room, and one to a woman at a cafe across the square. She put both in the same envelope and addressed it to herself. In another room, Chiara unfolded the boy's torn drawing and placed her half-runway on the desk. She traced the line where the paper had parted and imagined sewing it with thread, not to erase the tear, but to honor its shape. Palermo, generous and nosy, kept its distance with effort. Strangers carried groceries upstairs. Priests offered quiet rooms without questions. A mechanic changed a tire for free and said it was nothing. The sky cooled the city with a breeze that had crossed 2 languages. Somewhere, a dog barked twice at nothing, reconsidered, and went to sleep. In the morning, there would be hearings and offers and paperwork that insisted on dates. For now, there were dishes drying on racks, a basil leaf bruised on a wrist, a tile wrapped in tissue on a bedside table, the ordinary piece of a door locked from the inside. Morning arrived with the industrious clatter of shutters and teaspoons. Teresa left the hotel early with the map folded into a narrow strip and found the wine shop she had circled on her paper. The doorbell chimed a note that could have been the same as before. Inside, bottles lined the wall like a choir. A man in his 30s looked up from inventory and offered a practiced smile that softened when Teresa said she used to buy a certain Nero d'Avola here from an owner who kept coins in a blue bowl near the till. He pointed to a photograph on the wall. His father, with hair and mischief. He would hide the good vintages in the back for people who asked nicely, the son said. And then, after a beat, for teachers most of all. He disappeared into the storeroom and returned with a bottle that wore an old label like a scar that had healed well. Teresa paid in cash, and the man refused the change, claiming it was for the bowl that wasn't there anymore. Outside, she tucked the bottle in her bag as if smuggling a message through customs. We are still ourselves. Marco walked to the school and stood at the gate a moment, listening for the particular silence of classrooms between bells. A custodian recognized the way a teacher looks at a building and waved him in. The principal, younger than Marco had expected and older in the eyes, gave him a visitor badge that read Docent, as if the word could tunnel between years. In a classroom with light that struck the floor at an angle he remembered, he told students how to read a story that doesn't know it's a story yet. A boy at the back asked if the whole thing was a hoax. The class inhaled. Marco said he didn't blame him for asking. The test for truth isn't how strange it is, he said, but whether it keeps feeding you once the strangeness fades. After, the principal showed him a cabinet where his name was still faintly penciled on a shelf. "We never sanded it off," she said, "in case you came back to claim your chalk." He laughed, and because the room deserved ceremony, he wrote the date on the board in careful script, the way he had taught his students to do. Paolo met Elena at the market and walked slowly enough that memory could keep up. Stalls glittered with fish that looked carved from moonlight. A vendor recognized Elena's face from a newspaper and wrapped 2 slices of swordfish without asking for money. Paolo protested, and the vendor winked at Elena. "He still argues." Across the square, Anna sat at a cafe with a notebook open and a pen that did more erasing than writing. After the market, they all met by the fountain as arranged. The fountain, having no patience for human suspense, kept pouring. They spoke rules into existence, mornings for walking, afternoons for paperwork, no ambushes of surprise. When a tourist asked for a photograph thinking they were actors from a series, the 3 of them burst into the same helpless laugh, and the tourist, catching the contagion, laughed too and backed away without the picture. The city applauded in small ways. A driver waited at a crosswalk longer than Sicilian time demands. A dog shared shade. Chiara and Captain Mariani spent 2 hours in a room that smelled of polished wood and long answers. Commissioners asked with courtesy that sharpened at the edges, headings, altitudes, any deviations, any sounds. They told the truth. Ordinary air, ordinary systems, then a gap like a missing plank in a bridge you swear you walked across safely. A physicist with kind hands asked permission to examine the drawing Chiara had taken from the boy, the 2 half runways. She said no, not yet. On the steps outside, Mariani admitted to Chiara he had started hearing phantom chimes at night, the seatbelt sign pinging in a room with no interphone. She confessed she had learned to sleep with the cabin's hum playing softly on her phone, a lullaby of air through ducts. "We're building a cockpit out of habits," he said. "Good," she answered. "Let's fly it into an ordinary day." The boy with the dinosaur backpack visited grandparents he had last seen when their hair was less white and their hands less transparent. They produced a box of toys saved with religious stubbornness, as if their faith had been in plastic and patience. He lined the dinosaurs on the table and announced, with new data from the museum, that strength was complicated and speed counted too. His grandmother, delighted to be corrected, added that kindness was the fastest of all. On the way back, they passed a mural of saints whose gold leaf had been restored. The mother thought, not irreverently, that the painters had given time a second coat. As dusk gathered itself, Palermo did what cities do when language fails. It made a ritual. Without speeches and with very few phones, people drifted to the harbor. The violinist stood by the rail and tuned under the sound of gulls. Someone passed out sheets of paper no larger than a hand. On each was printed the word Arrivati. Teresa wrote Marco's name on hers and then, unable to resist grammar, added an exclamation mark. Paolo handed Elena and Anna each a paper, and they both, without consulting, wrote the same word. Here, the violinist played something between lament and lullaby, and the harbor wind arranged hair and hem. On account no one heard, the papers were set afloat with little beeswax candles. Some went out at once. Others traveled surprising distances, bright commas in the sentence of the sea. No one tried to read meaning into which survived. Meaning was the water itself. Later, back in the hotel, Teresa opened the wine with the practiced twist that had not forgotten her. She poured 2 small glasses and tapped her rim to Marco's. "To late arrivals," she said. To arrivals that feel exactly on time, he replied. She set the tile from Julia on the nightstand, a square of yesterday under the lamp. Marco slid the keys from his pocket and placed them on top of it. The metal rang a bright syllable. Messages chimed on both their phones. A court clerk confirming a hearing date. A teacher from Rome sending a photograph of his blackboard with Marco's handwriting copied in chalk by 20 hands. The wine shop sending a receipt that ended with grazie. Professor Teresa lay down and listened to the city think. Somewhere, a television announced soccer scores. Somewhere, a baby corrected the future with a cry. Before sleep, Teresa took out the postcard she had been asked to write to herself from 2003. She uncapped a pen that smelled faintly of almonds and wrote slowly, as if the ink had to cross a border. Buy the wine. Keep the keys. Time is not a thief. It is a complicated landlord. We are home. She did not sign it. The handwriting would tell her later who she had been. She propped it against the tile and turned off the light. And in the soft afterglow of the room, she could almost see the balcony of the old apartment. The exact shadow the basil used to cast on summer walls. The dent in a cushion that Marco's shoulder had once made and would make again. Outside, the sea folded itself neatly and then unfolded, practicing arrival. The prefecture's hall smelled faintly of wax and old promises. Families took their seats in rows that refused symmetry. Some sat forward with elbows on knees, others leaned back as if the chairs were holding them up by grace alone. The commission chair began with careful sentences that had been rehearsed against the bluntness of bewilderment. Preliminary findings, he said, showed no evidence of sabotage, no weather anomaly, no mechanical fault. The recorders ended as if someone had lifted the needle between songs. They would not label this an act of God because science hates metaphors. They would not call it a miracle because grief hates shortcuts. For now, it was an event without a category. Teresa raised a hand and asked, in the voice teachers use when they are tired but still listening, whether there would be a page in the report for how to keep living. The chair, out of his depth and decent, said they would try. After the session, a corridor turned into an annex of deliberation. Marco proposed to a city councilwoman a scholarship in Palermo for students who lost a parent and for those who found one again. The councilwoman wrote it down as if ink could anchor it to the world. Teresa spoke with a priest and an imam who had prayed side by side at the harbor and asked them to bless the apartment that wasn't theirs anymore. Both agreed, saying homes travel in people, not walls. Outside, a man with a camera lowered it when he recognized himself in the glass, middle-aged, rumpled, out of stories, and walked away. Paolo, Eleanor, and Anna attended a mediation session in a room intentionally ugliest, so no one could mistake the place for home. The mediator invited them to imagine a calendar and place their names on days like pieces on a board. They chose Thursdays for walking together when the city was less loud, Sundays alternating for lunches, a rule that no message sent after midnight demanded immediate reply. They drafted a joint note. No interviews, no blame, gratitude for privacy, and signed all 3 names without titles. On their way out, Paolo bought 3 cones at the same gelateria and did not try to decide which smile he loved more, because the answer would be dishonest to the hour. Back at the airport, the MD-82 had been towed into a hangar where temporary scaffolds rose like thoughtful bones. Chiara walked the jetway alone, her footsteps making a metronome of the space. She paused at the threshold and said a small hello to the galley before entering. Gloves on, she touched nothing, looked at everything, the seat back that never latched perfectly, the overhead that needed a nudge. In the cockpit, she stood behind the captain's chair and imagined a hand reaching to set altitude, the old choreography that lives in muscle before it lives in mind. A curator from a museum spoke softly at the doorway, explaining that they might preserve the aircraft as found, not polished into explanation. "Leave the coffee stain," Chiara said, surprising herself. "It tells the truth." The boy with the dinosaur backpack began learning Palermo the way children do, by turning corners into secrets. His mother took him past the school he would attend. The headmistress came out, shook their hands, and introduced them to a custodian who remembered the boy's grandfather's laugh. They visited a park where a new slide had replaced an old climbing frame. He decided the new slide was good, but the old frame had better stories. At dinner, he arranged two dinosaurs facing each other on the table and declared a truce between strength and speed. His mother taught him a word she had been practicing all day: enough, and he tried it on like a jacket and kept it. That night, Teresa set the shoebox on the hotel bed and opened it at last. Inside lay the airline's last letter, brittle at the edges, the photo of Marco with sunburn and books, a receipt from the wine shop stamped in purple ink from a date that now felt like a prologue. She read the letter aloud without rancor, a litany of condolences from a company that no longer existed, and then folded it once more, smaller, until it became a square the size of her palm. Marco held the photo to the light and recognized a book he had long since given away in a movie he hadn't made. "We can put this on the new kitchen wall," he said. "We can argue about nails like we used to." Teresa laughed, because arguing had always been one of their best languages. In a bar near the harbor, Captain Mariani met a mechanic who had retired the year after the disappearance. The man placed a hand the size of a wrench on Mariani's shoulder and said, "Machines carry the news we give them." They spoke of checks and intervals, of the sweet spot where caution becomes care and not paralysis. When they ran out of language, they let the sea do the talking. Before parting, the mechanic handed over a faded maintenance tag he'd kept as a superstition. On it, in pencil, someone from 2003 had written, "Next due, tomorrow." Mariani slid it into his wallet. It felt right to keep a tomorrow that wouldn't expire. The commission released a brief statement the following day. No cause yet, full resources committed, human considerations paramount. It was bureaucratic and, for once, accurate to the world, provisional, humble. People resumed the labor of ordinary things. Teresa bought bread from a baker who insisted on adding 2 pastries because his mother had been a teacher. Marco met with the principal about a temporary post and left with chalk dust on his fingers like a benediction. Paolo walked alone for an hour and came back with 3 lemons and the first sentence of a story he might write. A man waited at a gate and time, bored, went to get a coffee and came back 20 years late. When the bells marked midnight, Palermo answered with windows opening to let out the day's heat. On 100 sills, Basil leaned toward moonlight. In the hangar, the MD-82 kept its own vigil, a body that had learned too much silence. In hotel rooms and borrowed beds, the returning lay awake or slept with fists unclenched. Tomorrow there would be more hearings, more forms, more explanations that would satisfy no one and still be needed. Tonight, there was the sound of scooters far off, the grammar of waves, and the steady, astonishing fact of breath counting itself to morning. They did not plan a ceremony for endings. They planned a Tuesday. Morning errands, a list on the fridge, the kind of day that could hide a life inside it. The office for returnees opened with the squeak of a door and the smell of photocopy toner. Teresa set out 2 mugs and a bowl of wrapped candies and wrote, "Welcome," on a scrap of paper because the sign printer was late. People came in 1s and 2s, asking small questions whose answers changed everything. How do I change my bank to a name that never really went away? Do I have to keep the death certificate? What do I call the years when I was gone? Teresa learned the music of saying we'll find out together. At noon, Marco arrived with a stack of handouts, little essays about how to breathe at the comma, how to speak to children about time without scaring them into holding their breath. He stood by the window and looked at a city that had decided to be hospitable to paradox and felt something click into place like a well-hung door. Across town, the hangar smelled of oil and reverence. The museum team had positioned soft lights along the MD-82's fuselage, not to flatter it, but to let it confess. Chiara placed her half of the boy's drawing beside a placard that read, "Runways, divided and shared, and let the torn edge show." The boy, wearing a new backpack with the old dinosaur stitched on by a grandmother's patient hands, handed over the other half at last. The curator did not join the pieces. He pinned them a breadth apart, so visitors would have to bridge the space with their own eyes. Captain Mariani stood with the retired mechanic and touched the faded maintenance tag in his wallet. Tomorrow, he would fly a line to Cagliari, brief and ordinary. He wanted the ordinary and, for the first time, trusted it to want him back. Paolo invited Elena and Anna to dinner at a small trattoria that did not mind rearranging tables to fit complicated shapes. They ordered shared things: bread for three, a salad that knew how to be passed. They talked about weather and recipes and the soccer season, not to avoid the deeper water, but to warm their legs before wading in. When the owner learned who they were, he sent out a dish from the kitchen and refused to say more. It tasted of fennel and apology and second chances. They laughed at nothing in particular and discovered that laughter could be a truce as well as a victory. Walking home, they paused on a bridge while the night took inventory of their silhouettes and agreed on a rule for the weeks ahead. When the heart stumbles, the others will slow their pace. Teresa and Marco shopped for a first meal in the new kitchen, arguing cheerfully over anchovies versus capers. At the checkout, a cashier of about 20, whose mother had been a teenager at the memorials, said she was glad they had come back and did they need help carrying anything heavy. "Only time," Teresa said before she could stop herself, and then softened it with a smile. In the apartment, they unpacked objects that had waited patiently in bags. The tile from Julia beneath the light, the photograph of sunburn and books, the keys in a bowl by the door that made the old sound when dropped. Marco boiled pasta in a pot that had known other stoves and salted the water until it tastes like the sea, as Teresa had always taught him. They ate standing up, tasting for seasoning, then sat, the table suddenly a stage where nothing was pretending. At dusk, the harbor gathered them again, not for candles this time, but for a concert of ordinary noise: gulls, scooters, the soft percussion of shoes on stone. The violinist played a tune that had learned from both lament and reel, and refused to choose. Children ran in safe loops. A priest and an imam traded recipes. A city councilwoman handed Marco the draft scholarship decree with fresh ink. He traced the letters as if they were carved. Chiara, hair pulled back and shoulders loose, lifted a paper cup of espresso to the boy and asked if speed and strength were still on speaking terms. "They made a schedule," he said gravely, and she laughed, and the sound joined the evening like a bird that had been there all along. When the first stars appeared, Teresa took from her bag the postcard she had written to herself and read it aloud just once. "Buy the wine, keep the keys. Time is not a thief, it is a complicated landlord. We are home." She did not fold it away. She gave it to Marco, who slid it under the tile on the wall, a hidden inscription for future repairs. They walked back through streets that had learned their names again, past windows where television light flickered, past a bakery cooling bread for tomorrow's certainty. On their landing, a neighbor's door opened with the unself-conscious intimacy of close quarters. A jar of basil cuttings changed hands with instructions simple and exact. Water, sun, a little patience. Night spread itself evenly. In the office, a plant remembered to lean toward the moon. In the hangar, a security guard paused by the MD-82 and rested his palm on its skin, the way you greet a reliable animal. In the trattoria, the owner added a new dish to the chalkboard and did not label it with a story. In the apartment, Teresa washed 2 glasses and left them to dry on a towel, and Marco, on impulse, set the old keys on the windowsill where the air could teach them the new temperature. They stood side by side at the open window, listening to a city count down to nothing in particular. There would be more papers to sign, more explanations to give, more days when the past tugged at their sleeves with a child's insistence. There would be moments when the ordinary failed, and they would call each other and rebuild it, plank by plank, until it held. But the hard part, the impossible part, had already happened, and it had not erased them, it had underlined them. Teresa closed the window, turned the latch with a click that sounded like a period. Marco switched off the light. In the darkness, their breath fell into an easy cadence that any cockpit would recognize. Outside, the sea practiced its single lesson, arriving and arriving and arriving, the runway of water accepting every landing with patience, the city answering with lights like beacons. Time, which had made an error and then apologized without words, kept its distance and kept its promise. They slept, not as if no time had passed, but as if time at last had agreed to go their speed.